Thanks everybody for showing up.
All right, thank you, Jason. And I'll echo Jason's gratitude to all of you for joining us this morning as part of this legislative wrap-up for the 2025 Arizona legislative session. Obviously, Congress is still in session, so we're not going to have the final word on everything that's gone on in DC, but we'll be talking certainly about some of the things that have happened so far this year. And we welcome your input, we welcome your questions. Just to let you know, you can post your questions in the chat. Jason will be keeping track of those. Michelle Thorne will be keeping track of those. They can relay them to me if necessary, because I'm not going to be able to see them. Or you can raise your hand and you can ask your questions out loud. We welcome them as we go along, or wait till the end and we can address them then, whatever is most comfortable for you. So let's dive right in, shall we? First of all, for those who are not familiar with the Arizona Developmental Disabilities Planning Council, which is the organization that Jason and I represent, we are one of 56 DD councils located in every United States state and territory. That includes obviously the 50 states plus Guam and Puerto Rico and the Marshall Islands and American Samoa and the U.S. Virgin Islands. And I think I'm probably forgetting one, but I apologize for that. Anyway, we're all over the place. We were established by federal statute, the DD Act, which many of you are probably familiar with, technically known as the Developmental Disabilities Assistance and Bill of Rights Act. We are charged with doing systems change advocacy on behalf of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. As part of that work, we work with the larger disability community as well, so people with physical disabilities, people with mental health challenges, a whole variety of different organizations. But our specific charge is to do work in the IDD space, and so that is what we do. I would emphasize we are not lobbyists because we are federally funded. We are not allowed to lobby. So we do not take positions on specific legislation. We do not take positions on specific candidates, but we do educate our policymakers, whether they are elected officials or appointed officials, about the impacts of various legislation that is being considered or various policies that are being talked about and potentially implemented. Our job is to do education. Our job is to rally people to speak out and have their voices heard, and really fundamentally to increase the self-determination of individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities across the state of Arizona. We also, just so you know, we are located within the Department of Economic Security here in the state of Arizona, but that's sort of an administrative matter. We do not speak for or represent any state agencies, whether they be DES, Access, the Department of Health Services, the governor's office, anything like that. We are an independent body, and so we do not, I don't want anything we have to say to be taken as a representation of any other state agency that we might work with. Now that that's all taken care of, let's talk about some of the things we saw during the Arizona legislative session, some of the things that are with us on a daily basis, some of the things that really got attention during the session that just ended very recently. First of all, no question that from the disability perspective, DD system services, eligibility, funding, they were all top of mind for people in the disability community. And we're going to go into some detail about how the DD system was affected by what took place at the legislature this year. Also related to people with disabilities, there were a lot of safety issues. A number of bills were introduced this year around personal safety, and that is, bills that touched on school emergency response plans and school resource officers and school safety officers. There were also bills that addressed this ongoing epidemic of abuse and neglect of individuals with disabilities. Now, many of the bills were broader in their effect than just the disability community, but ever since the Hacienda incident back in 2018, it's been pretty obvious that the disability community has had grave concerns about abuse and neglect of people with disabilities or abuse and neglect of vulnerable individuals in our state. And we've done a lot of work. The council has invested a lot of money in addressing this problem, and we're glad to see that there continue to be proposals in the legislature to take further steps at making Arizona a safer place for vulnerable individuals. Number of bills were introduced this year around elections and voting. And now this is something we have seen, well, we've seen it at least every year, at least since 2020. The issue of election security, of having only the most appropriate voters vote in our election, only truly eligible voters vote in our elections. It's been it's been a hot topic, and there have been a lot of accusations that our voting systems, our election systems, are not fair, that they are rigged, that they are corrupt. You know, you name it. There have been accusations. On the other hand, there are a lot of folks in our state who believe that our system works pretty darn well, and that in fact we need to be reaching out to more individuals who are eligible to vote to make sure that they are registered and they are casting a ballot. So there is a divide, certainly, and a number of the bills that were proposed this year would have promoted further restrictions on voting access. That's why it's of importance to us in the disability community, because we know that a great many people with disabilities who are eligible to vote are not necessarily exercising the franchise. So we are trying to expand the awareness of people's right to vote if they are eligible, and their participation in the voting process. Some of these bills that were introduced this year, in our opinion, would have made that more difficult. And we'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later. There were also bills introduced to clamp down on diversity, equity, inclusion, and access, diversity, equity, and inclusion in particular, on trainings, on mandatory education around DEI initiatives, on the very presence of DEI programs within certain parts of state government. And then more specifically, there were some proposals around sexual orientation, gender identity, transgender issues, very much in the news recently, very much in the news over the last several years. We see it at both the federal and state level, and you know, the participation of transgender athletes in sports, in high schools, that kind of thing. So there were pieces of legislation introduced that would have addressed concerns around that issue. This is clearly not an all-inclusive list of the things that came before the legislature this year, but these are some that, from the perspective of the council, we saw as the highest priority, the things we wanted to keep our eyes on, because even things that perhaps don't seem to have an immediate impact on people with disabilities, like DEI issues, they can affect the disability community, because in fact, much of the work we do is about expanding the embrace of our communities toward people with disabilities, about inclusion of people with disabilities in their communities and in the social fabric. And so sometimes when we use those words, things get lumped together, and sometimes there's misunderstanding, and sometimes things get painted with a very broad brush. So we want to make sure that there's education about what we mean when we talk about diversity, when we talk about equity, when we talk about inclusion, as they relate to the disability community. There was this thing that happened this year. Maybe you heard about it, maybe you didn't. Turns out that the Division of Developmental Disabilities faced a bit of a crisis in 2025, in fiscal year 2025. In fact, a lot of people got very exercised about this issue, people in government, people outside of government, and it's probably obvious why that was the case. DDD funding is a lifeline for individuals with disabilities, with developmental disabilities in this state, many of whom also have, of course, physical disabilities. But DDD programming is absolutely essential to the quality of life of individuals who are members of DDD, who receive services through the Arizona Long-Term Care System, who receive services through the Arizona Healthcare Cost Containment System, ACCESS. If the DDD system were allowed to fail, which clearly was a possibility this year, it would have, well, unfathomable impacts on people with disabilities in Arizona. And so when we looked at the fact that Arizona had a potential $122 million shortfall in funding for DDD, it was clear that action had to be taken. And there were a lot of reasons why that shortfall was projected. It turned out that the Parents as Paid Caregivers program took a lot of the heat, at least from legislators, for that shortfall. But the reality is that program was far from the sole culprit. In fact, Arizona, as many of you know, is a very popular state for people who have developmental disabilities, who have disabilities in general, because we have a very good and very robust DD system. It's well funded, generally speaking. It's certainly not ideal, but what we saw among the causes for the shortfall was caseload growth. Simply the number of people applying for and being deemed eligible for DD services. And so in order to meet that need, you have to spend more money. Money makes the world go round in the DD world. So the caseload growth was a significant contributor to that. The increased costs of doing business for providers, for DDD, for various other players in the system, those costs continue to rise. We all know that we've seen some pretty significant inflation over recent years. We've also had minimum wage increases that have caused providers to have to pay more to their staffs. Parents as Paid Caregiver program was certainly part of the issue because once that program was instituted, we saw greater utilization of the hours that had already been granted to individuals. But it's unfair to say that that program was the reason for the shortfall, was the sole reason for the shortfall, when in fact it was just one of many different reasons why DDD faced this $22 million cliff that it was potentially going to fall off of. What would have happened had it been allowed to fall short is that we could have seen a whole host of changes to the system. There would have likely been reductions in the services provided to members over the course of at least the last quarter of fiscal year 2025, and that's April, May, and June of this year. Some providers were faced with the possibility of having to close their doors because at one point the state was asking providers to prepare for up to a month or two of not getting paid until money could be made available to them. Most providers do not have those kind of reserves and would not be able to pay their staff, keep their lights on, keep their doors open if they weren't being paid on a consistent basis. Many provider staff were facing the prospect of being laid off. Obviously, if organizations are not operating, they don't need staff, and those staff could have to go elsewhere. What we did see on that score is that in some cases, and fortunately it was not statewide, it was not widespread, but we did see some provider staff actually leaving their organizations proactively to find better jobs where they felt a greater sense of security. They didn't have to worry about the possibility of their jobs being eliminated and them being left out in the cold. There was even talk about the legislature not appropriating the funds needed to get DDD through the fiscal year and the program becoming insolvent, and basically DDD services being shut down for several months toward the end of fiscal year 25, which ended at the end of June. So how did the community respond? Well, I think it's fair to say that we saw a show of advocacy on the part of the disability community that we have not seen in years, perhaps ever. Advocates for people with developmental disabilities turned out in droves at rallies, at marches, at meetings at the Capitol, at hearings of the various appropriations committees and the Health and Human Services committees. They turned out in numbers that I have never seen in almost 15 years working in this field. They turned out educated, understanding the issues, ready to speak about the issues, and ready to forcefully and personally share their stories about why DDD services matter, why all text matters, why funding the system was absolutely in the best interest of not only the people they care for or themselves if they were speaking as self-advocates, but also the best interest of this state. And they were not shy. I give tremendous credit to several of the folks who organized many of these events. Brandy Kuhn at Raising Voices Coalition, Kathleen Muldoon, a whole variety of others. Michelle Thorne, who's on this call today with Care for the Caregivers. Wide variety of different organizations and individuals who organized the effort to make our legislature aware of why DDD funding mattered. What was the impact? Well, you know, if you watched any of the hearings or if you attended any of the hearings, you know that that the legislators who were pushing back against giving in on this funding they got a little testy. They responded in some cases in ways that they later apologized for. They responded in some cases in ways that were a little disrespectful to the disability community. I'm saying this from a personal perspective. I'm not speaking on behalf of ADDPC at this point, but the fact is some of their responses could have been better phrased, could have been more timely, could have been a little more understanding of what people with disabilities go through and what their caregivers go through. They did not respond as sympathetically as I think many in the disability community expected. And this became quite a media event, quite a media topic. It was not uncommon to see daily reports through the Arizona Republic, through various other publications, through the electronic media, and certainly online about the progress of this debate to get funding for DDD. The primary issues lay with the appropriations committees in the House and the Senate. And it was the House Appropriations Committee that was probably the biggest hurdle for the disability community. And it was clear that the House Appropriations Committee was going to try and extract as many concessions from the governor's office as it possibly could before it actually came through with the funding. And by the way, I should note, as belligerent as many legislators were, as difficult as it was to get approval of funding, it was made clear on numerous occasions throughout the session that the legislature was going to come through with this funding. It was stated by leadership on the appropriations committees. They never made any issue about whether they would come through with the money. The question was when and how much people in the disability community were going to have to suffer and worry before the funding came through, and how many concessions could be gotten from the governor's office related to a variety of different issues before that funding was made available. Well, the governor's response was toward the middle of April to simply state that she was not going to sign any more bills that had landed on her desk until the funding was approved, until a resolution was arrived upon for this situation. That seems to have been the primary motivation for the folks in the legislature to actually take the action that was necessary to get a supplemental bill on her desk that she could sign. So when I say that the legislators caved, to some degree they did. To some degree they gave in when they saw that their bills were not going to get signed and that very little further action was going to be taken seriously by the governor until they came to her and she came to them and they were able to arrive upon a compromise. And that's exactly what they arrived upon. Representative Julie Willoughby, Representative Nancy Gutierrez in the House, both members of the Appropriations Committee, they were able to craft a compromise bill, which ultimately became House Bill 2945, the DDD supplemental funding bill, which the governor approved, the governor signed, and in late April, it became effective and DDD received the funding it was going to receive. So that was the end of it, right? Everybody was pleased as punch. Well, maybe not. The legislators were able to get some changes to various programs, and this is not, again, not an all-inclusive list, but what we saw primarily was new limits on the Parents as Paid Caregivers program. In particular, limits on the number of hours for which parents could be paid to be caregivers for their children and the circumstances under which that care could be given. So there were some new restrictions, and those went into effect June 1st, and then more of them will go into effect this fall. Or I'm sorry, some went into effect July 1st, others will, or no, I'm sorry, June 1st, others will go into effect this fall. But the point is, there are going to be some new rules around how parents can be caregivers and how they can get paid for them and under what circumstances. There are also restrictions on parents that they can only now be employed by one provider agency in order to be a provider for their own children, rather than being employed by multiple agencies and getting paid by multiple agencies. DES and Access now also have to come up with what's known as what they're calling a new assessment for extraordinary care needs that will guide which parents can be deemed eligible to be providers for their own children. And the bill includes a provision for the Auditor General's office to do a special audit of that particular program, of the Parents as Paid Caregivers program, to make sure that it's being operated effectively, efficiently, with integrity, and so forth. Again, as I said earlier, a lot of attention was paid to this program in particular, in my opinion, unjustly. It certainly deserves to have attention paid to it. It certainly deserves to be run effectively and efficiently, but it cannot be held as the solely responsible party when it comes to the budget shortfall. And even with the signing of this bill, it still seems to be getting outsized attention from the legislature. In addition, the legislators required as part of this bill that all future Medicaid waiver amendments that meet certain criteria must get legislative approval before they can be submitted to the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or CMS, at the federal level. Until this time, most waiver amendment issues could be dealt with straight between Access and CMS. Now it's going to require more legislative oversight, and the legislature is now requiring that every state agency, this goes well beyond Access or DES, but every state agency that now receives federal funds under various conditions has to report on the use of those funds and what would happen if those funds were reduced or taken away. Every state agency. Now, there are some special provisions in here for universities, because universities get federal funding in a variety of different ways, through grants and all of that. So the universities have a sort of a different set of requirements, but now the legislature, the Joint Legislative Budget Committee, wants to have more oversight on how federal funds are received and how federal funds are utilized across the state of Arizona. So the legislature wants to have a much bigger role in a number of different areas moving forward. And they don't want to simply allow the state agencies to oversee these programs without legislative involvement. That was certainly one budget issue, but that was a budget issue that related to fiscal year 25. That was for a supplemental appropriation to get DDD through fiscal 25. What about fiscal 26, which began on July 1st? Well, when it comes to the disability world, there was some good news. The reality is that DD funding was increased for the year. In particular, the capitation rate was increased by almost 13%. That's an adjustment upward that was, well, unquestionably needed. The legislature is saying, and the governor's office is saying, that that means the capitation is fully funded for the year ahead. And in simple terms, capitation is the per person amount that CMS pays to the state for Medicaid services for people in different categories. And in the DD category, that means that the state is committing to meet what it expects to be growth in the number of people needing care through the DD system over the next year, about 13% increase in cost. It's probably not a very good way of describing it, but that's the best I can do for you. They're calling this adjustment fully funding capitation for the coming year. But the reality is that the capitation rate is always an estimate. It is never guaranteed. We cannot ever know as a state what the exact cost is going to be for the year ahead, because in fact, it's not a fixed amount. I mean, the amount per person, the base amount per person is fixed, but individual costs often exceed those amounts, and the state and the Medicaid program agree to pay those additional costs if people are eligible for certain programs. And in the DD program, there's no question that most people cost more than the simple capitation rate. So that's always an estimate, and what it means is that we as a disability community, the governor's office, the legislature, everybody is going to be keeping a very close eye on the budget throughout fiscal year 26, because there's every possibility that another supplemental funding bill will be needed as we go through the year. Now, I should point out, and I know that many of you are already aware of this, supplemental appropriations are not an extraordinary thing. Supplemental appropriations are made every year in our legislature, and for a variety of different reasons, not just disability issues, but they can cover a lot of different areas. They can cover transportation or health services or criminal justice or a variety of different things, and they're a pretty common thing. For the DD system, $122 million was pretty extraordinary. Never before has DDD had to come and ask for that kind of money. But supplementals in particular, or as a general rule, are not extraordinary. if DDD needs to go back and ask for another supplemental in the coming year, it wouldn't be, it wouldn't necessarily be a sign of the apocalypse, but given what happened this year, it might raise more eyebrows in the legislature and might cause certain legislators to want to exert even more control over the DD system than it already does. So it's something very much to keep an eye on, very much to be aware of as we go through. And perhaps most importantly, when it comes to DD funding for fiscal year 26, there was yet again no provider rate increase, which is a problem. It's a problem because, as I said a few minutes ago, provider costs are going up. The cost to recruit and retain good people is going up. There's all kinds of competition for workers out there. The Arizona economy remains relatively strong. Getting and keeping high quality individuals, people who are committed to their work, people who can do the work, is very, very difficult, and providers across the state are struggling with this and have been struggling with this for a number of years. So without a provider rate increase, it's going to become even more difficult for them to find and keep those good people. It's also going to be difficult for them to run their programs. Once again, costs for all kinds of things are going up, for utilities, for facilities maintenance, for lots of other things. And so providers continue to be squeezed a little in this state. I mean, actually more than a little in this state, regarding their ability to do the work that they are contracted with the state to do. As a case in point, and as kind of an illustration of some of the need for a provider rate increase, if you can remember back to January this year, I know that was a long time ago. It seems even longer because so many things have happened over the course of that time. But back in January, when Governor Hobbs introduced her budget proposal, she included a 3-year rate increase for the early intervention, DDD, and EPD, or elderly and physically disabled providers systems. That would have amounted to about $92 million overall over the course of 3 years, roughly $30 to $31 million per year. Well, unfortunately, as I just said, that went out the window. None of that funding was included in the final budget. None of those systems is going to see a provider rate increase. As dramatically as they may need the rate increase, they're not going to see it for this year. So they're going to have to make do with essentially level funding from what they had in fiscal year 2025. And as I said, it's going to cause a number of issues. We hope that it does not cause providers to go out of business. We hope that it does not cause more people to leave, more DSPs to leave the service system. But I think we should anticipate that it's going to become much tighter for providers as we move forward into the next fiscal year. So let's talk about some of the other legislation that was passed this year, just to give you kind of an overview. There were a little over 1,700 bills introduced in the legislature this year. That is not a record for the number of bills introduced. That we've had more in recent years. Normally, though, it's in the range of 1,600 to 1,800, maybe 1,900 bills introduced. By the way, there were a lot of other memorials and resolutions and things like that introduced as well. Those are not included in this number because they don't require the governor's action if, in fact, they passed. The number of bills passed this year was 439. As usual, it's a relatively small percentage of the total number introduced. By the way, a lot of those that were introduced never even made it through the committee hearing process. You all know how that all works. Some of them just died without getting a hearing. Some of them died in committee. Some of them, died once they were transmitted from one chamber to the other. In any case, 439 passed, 265 were signed by the governor, and 174 were vetoed by the governor. None of those vetoes were overridden by the legislature, which of course has the power to override vetoes if they can garner the requisite number of votes to do so. In this case, none of them could be overridden. Just as a little bit of trivia, the number of days in this session, 185 days. That is the second longest legislative session in Arizona history. The only one that was longer was in 2023, and that one went 201 days. So in recent years, we have been seeing longer and longer sessions. largely as a result of budget negotiations, which can cause the session to drag on. That was clearly the case in 23 and clearly the case again this year in 25. The number of vetoes. Governor Hobbs set a record this year for the number of vetoes signed or issued by the governor. This year, 174. That was 34 or 31 more than her previous record, which was in 2023 of 143. And to give you some indication of where things stand between the governor's office and the legislature these days, the next highest number after that 143 was 58. And that was in 2005, and that was Governor Napolitano. 58, the difference between 58 and 143, I'll let you do the math, but it's quite a lot. So we can see that there is often these days distinct disagreement between the governor and the legislature on what deserves to be passed into law or what deserves to be signed into law. On that score, what did get signed in some very broad categories, there were some good bills related to people with disabilities this year. Representative Gress introduced a bill that passed and was signed related to school safety plans and the training necessary for school safety officers and school resource officers. It increased the requirements for training, increased the requirements that they be knowledgeable in how to work with students with disabilities. Now, I'm going to say I think there are some weaknesses in this bill. It doesn't specify the kind of training that individuals need to have. It doesn't specify the amount or who's going to provide it, but it does specify that training is required. So it's a step in the right direction. This has not existed before, and we know that it might be iterative. There might be an evolution in how this legislation provides for better safety and better interaction between students with disabilities and school safety personnel. We will continue to work on this issue. I know that many other organizations will as well. Representative Willoughby, one of the champions for the DDD supplemental funding bill, got a bill passed this year related to voluntary disclosure of disability on driver's license and vehicle registration applications, not on the license itself, not on the vehicle registration form that's kept in a vehicle, but on the application, so that if individuals need some kind of communication accommodation, they can indicate that when they apply for their license, they can indicate it when they apply for their vehicle registration, and then law enforcement, if they were to pull that person's vehicle over, they could see in their computer system that that person requires some kind of different form of communication and could accommodate the way they approach the vehicle based on that knowledge. Now, a shortcoming in this is that it doesn't provide any further training for law enforcement officials or officers on how to communicate with the individual, but it at least alerts them so that they're aware when they approach the vehicle, the person could potentially need to communicate somewhat differently. And perhaps they will call on other resources. Perhaps they will receive training because there are trainings available. But further work needs to be done on this. Again, a step in the right direction, though, to help improve the safety of interactions between law enforcement and individuals with disabilities. Some other proposals, again, Representative Gress with House Bill 2611, providing some alternative sentencing accommodations for individuals with cognitive disabilities or developmental disabilities who might be convicted of committing aggravated assault. And then the Safe Alert program. Some of you may remember back in 2018, the Silver Alert was expanded to include not just older Arizonans, but individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities as well, who might wander from their place of safety and might need to be found by law enforcement outside of their immediate neighborhood or even outside of their immediate city or town. This is an iteration, a further iteration of the Silver Alert. The Silver Alert program is now known as the Safe Alert, and that means seek and find. And it includes some additional individuals. It expands the criteria for who's eligible to be included in a Safe Alert. And it requires some additional training for law enforcement officers across the state of Arizona, so they understand how the system works and they understand how to implement a Safe Alert should it become available. So this is a really nice step in the right direction. That Silver Alert has been enormously effective for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities over the years. And this, we think, is just going to make it even more effective, not only for the disability community, but for the broader community as well. More safety bills, one that passed the legislature but was vetoed by the governor last year, Senate Bill 1106, or AVA's law, It was amended a little bit this year to get through the process and get the governor's signature. This in particular holds public entities and most specifically school systems responsible and accountable if people they hire have not been properly vetted, if the proper screening has not been done before they are hired to determine if they have a history of sexual violence against other individuals, to make sure that they are not perpetrators against students or other individuals served by these public entities. This is a very important bill, we believe, a very good step in the right direction. We're really grateful to the legislature and to the governor for seeing this bill through and for signing it into law. Some other bills related to mandatory reporting, Senator Werner, a mandatory reporting bill related to school personnel expands the range of school personnel who have to report things that they see, and it expands the protections for students when an incident of abuse is suspected and reported. Some other bills related to behavioral health facilities and the court system. I'm not going to go into detail on those in the interest of time, but happy to talk to anybody about those if you're interested. Regarding eligibility, regarding DDD services, Senator Shamp introduced a bill related to children placed by DCS in various facilities. It increases the requirement that, especially in group homes, in DCS group homes or group homes for children who have medical needs, complex medical needs, that the staffing the staffing requirements be higher, that staff be better trained in how to administer medications, that they be better trained in how to serve the complex needs of these children who are placed in state care. And it makes some other provisions as well, but I think for children with disabilities or children with complex medical needs in particular, it's a great improvement. Senator Shope introduced a bill that now allows physical therapists to sign the form for people who are applying for a disability placard for their vehicle. There's a whole range of professionals who can sign that form to demonstrate the person's eligibility for that placard. Physical therapists are now among that cohort of professions that can sign. In education, Representative Gress once again, and by the way, I want to point out, for a lot of people, Matt Gress was one of the biggest antagonists related to the DDD funding supplemental this year. He's the House Appropriations Vice Chair. He was one of the people who was most adamant about the supplemental funding being tied to concessions from the governor's office. He was one of the people who pointed the finger most vehemently at the governor's office for DDD being in the position it was in. Well, he's much more than just an antagonist on that. In fact, he was a champion for a number of bills this year that affect the disability community. And as a former educator, he has he's worked as a budget analyst for the governor's office. He's worked in the education arena as a teacher. He understands a variety of issues, and he really came through on a number of things this year that affect students with disabilities. And House Bill 2170 is another example of this. So lest we paint people with just one brush, lest we assume they only sit on one side of a fence on issues around disability, we have to bear in mind that in this case, Representative Gress was a real champion for a number of things. And this bill requires that any student who has an IEP must have in that IEP a designation of whether he or she has a dyslexia diagnosis, so that the IEP can be more effective at serving the needs of that student. Senator Epstein introduced a bill that passed related to information available to families about who is providing health care in school settings, who's providing health services in school settings to students at that campus. And then Senator Farnsworth introduced a bill that increases, in some cases changes, the requirements of teachers for students who are blind and their competency with Braille. Around healthcare, a number of bills introduced. A rare disease advisory council established this year. We do know that many students with disabilities, many individuals with disabilities have rare conditions that often don't receive the kind of research or research funding that's necessary in order for treatments and potentially cures to be developed. The state has now developed and now established its rare disease advisory council, which to be honest, is advisory, but could provide some additional information and in the future would result in more funding for research in our state, at our state universities, at other research institutions to help treat some of these rare diseases. Senator Shamp introduced a bill that was passed that removes the annual caps for insurance coverage on services for autism. In many cases, insurance companies have been able to put annual dollar caps on the amount of care they will provide for autism services, the amount of autism services they will pay for. Those caps have now been removed as a result of Senate Bill 1590. And then Senate Bill 1711, introduced by Senator Gowan, has established a study committee around obesity treatment within access. Why is that important? Well, we know that that obesity can be a real issue for a lot of people who have cognitive disabilities, who have developmental disabilities. And this study committee may go some distance in helping identify ways that issue can be mitigated for the disability community. It's not specific to the disability community, but we hope that disability issues will be taken into account as the committee moves forward with its work. And then on just sort of a miscellaneous score, some other things that were included. House Bill 2068, Representative Cupper, this simply allows landlords to be free of liability for any damage or actions, any injuries that might be caused by service animals or purported service animals that are owned by residents of homes or apartments that they lease to them. There's a couple of bills related to procedural issues and notification issues in the legal system for guardianships and for the way trusts and estates are administered and who can serve as a personal representative in a trust or estate issue that involves a person with a cognitive disability. And then something that is potentially very exciting for us is a transportation bill that Senator Kavanaugh moved through the system this year, because not only does it provide some general transportation funding for the state, but it also establishes a transportation innovation fund. We know that even in large metropolitan areas in the state of Arizona, transportation for people with disabilities can be an enormous challenge. It's especially acute in rural areas where in many cases transportation options simply don't exist. And so people with disabilities have to rely upon family members or caregivers, and those aren't always available to them. We are hopeful, and we as an organization and many of our partners will be working to ensure that as part of this innovation fund, the needs of people with disabilities, the transportation needs of people with disabilities will be taken into account, and potentially projects will be developed, even if they're pilot projects, to institute transportation options for communities around the state where they are limited or non-existent for people with disabilities. So this is something we all recognize is a massive issue, and we will be working to try and make sure that some progress is made on them. I'm not going to go into the bills that were vetoed this year. Many of them are in those areas that I mentioned earlier that are areas of concern for us. Elections and voting, a lot of bills passed the legislature, which of course is controlled by the Republicans, but they were vetoed by the governor of the state, who is a Democrat. Again, we saw some dangers in some of those bills. We, again, could not take a position on those bills, but I think it's fair to say that we are pleased that some of that legislation did not go through, because we think it would have had a detrimental effect on people with disabilities who wish to vote. Similarly, SNAP work requirements, a couple of bills that went through that would have established work requirements on recipients of the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program in the state. This could be a moot point because federal legislation that just went through does include SNAP work requirements. So we will have to see how that all shakes out, and we'll talk about that a little bit in just a moment. There were also some proposals around eligibility for unemployment benefits that would have made it tougher to get those unemployment benefits, or limited the time frame for them. Some limits on access eligibility, some bills that address diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, or access, and then placement within the DES system. There was one bill in particular that caused us a little concern related to placement of individuals in the DCS, children in the DCS system, in families where not all members of the family had been vaccinated. We were particularly concerned, again, because many children with disabilities have multiple medical issues and we felt that it could present a danger to their health if they were placed in a situation where vaccinations were not up to date. That legislation passed, but it was ultimately vetoed by the governor. So there are still issues out there. It's clear that not everything was addressed this year, and most of them around the disability community touch upon provider funding. I talked about how there was no provider rate increase this year. Other things that were absolutely necessary in our minds anyway were not funded at the level they need to be. And so we're going to have to see what impact that has on the system moving forward. In particular, hiring and retention of direct support professionals, other staff members to keep the provider organizations operating at maximum efficiency, at their peak operational capacity. We also anticipate that we're going to see continued caseload growth, and it's going to be pretty extreme in the state of Arizona. We are, again, an attractive state for people to come to because of the service system. You know, health and safety for people with disabilities continues to be an issue. The healthcare system for people with disabilities, whether it's behavioral health, physical health, oral health, all of these need improvement. It's just too hard for people to access good quality, appropriate healthcare around the state, and issues of safety. We may never be able to address every issue of safety, especially in the area of abuse and neglect, but we certainly can do more than we are doing now. And then just network adequacy. We know that there are gaps still somewhere, some places in the system around the state where providers are not available, where it is difficult to get certain services, or there are long waits for certain services. So all of those will need to be looked at as we move forward. And lest I forget, the very sustainability of the DD service system is at risk. Why is that? Well, part of it is because of state funding and state level issues. Part of it has to do with what's going on at the federal level, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. Many of you may be aware that right now, Access is holding community forums, listening sessions about the future of the state's Medicaid waiver, which pays for DD services in this state. It's, in my mind anyway, an open question about whether we will be able to continue operating on our current Medicaid waiver. It's called an 1115 waiver, which provides for no waiting lists, provides for immediate services for anybody who's deemed eligible in this state, and makes the system as robust as it is and as attractive as it is for a lot of people. The alternative, which is what's used by most states in the country, is a 1915 waiver that allows for waiting lists, that allows for the reduction in certain services or limitations on certain services, a whole variety of other things. I'm not saying that that's something that's being discussed openly right now, but I think in the back of our minds, we always have to keep we have to keep in our thoughts that our system, because of what it does, is a more expensive system than in many other states. And if funding is going to be reduced, we may have to look at ways the system has to change. So I'm not predicting it. I'm not saying that that's what anybody in state government is saying, but I am saying that ultimately it could become a possibility if the funding is not available to sustain the system as it's currently constructed. So what's going on at the federal level? Well, you may also have heard about this thing that's been going on lately around federal funding of a whole variety of things, but in particular the Medicaid system. The new administration that has come into office has made a lot of changes. There have been cuts at a wide variety of federal agencies, almost across the board. Federal agencies have reduced their staffs, they've reduced their spending, all in an effort to, according to the administration, save taxpayer dollars. There have been reorganizations, even within our federal funding agency, the Department of Health and Human Services. On an almost daily basis, it seems, we are hearing about changes in the way that the organization is being structured. Just yesterday, we learned about the firing of two key officials, the Chief of Staff and Assistant Chief of Staff, to the Secretary of Health and Human Services. So major changes are taking place. The Administration for Community Living, which is where DD councils and protection and advocacy agencies and university centers for excellence in developmental disabilities, where we've all been located for years. That administration for community living is being done away with, and things are being folded into a new administration for children, family, and communities. So big changes to our world, big changes to a lot of other worlds, education, employment, energy, whole variety of things are now underway. We've also seen certain federal agencies withholding funds that were appropriated by Congress for things like education, like healthcare, a whole variety of other things. They have, at least temporarily, and in some cases it has taken court action to get them to release those funds, but we're seeing another round of funds being withheld that have been appropriated by Congress. A lot of legal arguments about whether that's allowable or not, and that's why the courts have been involved. But it is causing a lot of consternation among agencies that provide health and human services around the country. We've also seen some Supreme Court rulings that alter the way the federal government operates. Now, recently, we saw a very good ruling come out of the Supreme Court related to the educational assistance provided to students with IEP, students with disabilities, and the rights of students with disabilities to get a free and appropriate public education with the appropriate accommodations they need. So on the good side, we've seen that. On perhaps a more worrisome side, we've seen some Supreme Court rulings that provide the administration with a level of authority and a level of control that it has not had in the past. Typically, again, congressionally appropriated funds are designed to go where Congress says they should go, but now the administration is putting its hands into that and making more of those decisions about whether the funds actually go or not. And then, you know, a big issue, and the reason for the major bill that just passed Congress is this notion of tax relief and lowering taxes on Americans, providing tax breaks to, it is said, a large swath of American taxpayers. The reality is that what we've seen is tax relief that it overwhelmingly benefits higher earners in the American system and has a minimal impact for middle and lower class wage earners. But under the guise of tax relief, bills like HR 1 have gone through. Well, as a result of HR 1, which I will say once and only once was originally called the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, that is not its name. That name was stricken when it was under debate in the Senate. And I think from the disability community, it is a complete misnomer to use that name for it. So we will call it HR 1. What that bill does is put at risk a wide swath of programs that serve people with disabilities in every state in the union. These include all of the things you see on your screen. Healthcare, clearly, that is perhaps the biggest concern, but also education, civil rights, nutrition and energy assistance programs, transportation, voting rights, accessibility programs. All of these things and others are going to face changes if all of the provisions of HR 1 are put into place. When it comes to the disability community, there is no question that nothing matters like the Medicaid, and Medicaid is one of the biggest, maybe the biggest target in HR 1. Cuts to the Medicaid system as a result of this legislation are going to have, if again they are fully implemented, are going to have dramatic impacts on people with disabilities who rely upon state and federal systems to provide them services. If you're not familiar with Medicaid, I know you all are, but if you're not familiar with Medicaid, it is the primary funding source for home and community-based services. That's therapies that are provided in the community, day programs, employment programs, a lot of the care that provider organizations offer, a lot of the care that DDD professionals offer, a lot of the care that are received by children and adults by private agencies throughout the state of Arizona and other states are home and community-based resources. The list is quite long of the various things that fall under that category. The Arizona Healthcare Cost Containment System, or ACCESS, is Arizona's Medicaid agency. And DDD, the Division of Developmental Disabilities, is funded by Access to provide DD services. Now, interestingly, a great many people in Arizona do not know that Access is our Medicaid agency. And that's because in our infinite wisdom, Medicare, the federal program that serves the elderly, primarily the elderly with healthcare insurance, is called Medicare. Everywhere you go, it's called Medicare. But we have decided that because Medicaid is operated on a state basis and is a state-federal partnership, every state gets to choose what it wants to call its Medicaid system. So in Arizona, we call it Access. In Tennessee, they call it TennCare. In California, they call it Medi-Cal. It is as confusing as it can be, and so a lot of people who receive Medicaid services do not know they receive Medicaid services. And a consistent frustration over the course of the last several months, because as we tried to educate people about the impacts of HR 1 and tell them that if Medicaid is cut, it's going to affect you, a lot of folks would say, but I don't get Medicaid, I get Access. Well, Access is Medicaid. We cannot emphasize that strongly enough. It is a system that supports 71 million Americans in some form or fashion. Here's a list, a short list of the kinds of things that Medicaid covers in the United States. It is not just health insurance or health care, as a lot of people think. It also pays for housing for individuals with disabilities who receive the services through the Arizona long-term care system. Lots and lots of other things. It is the key source of public support for the disability community. 20% of all Americans rely upon Medicaid, 40% of children are on Medicaid, and 40% of adults with disabilities receive Medicaid services. It is vitally important. As a result of HR 1, we are looking at $1 trillion plus of cuts to the Medicaid system over the next 10 years. $1 trillion, that's with a T. What's that going to do to the system? If fully implemented, the kind of impacts are almost unimaginable. 11 million or more Americans will lose their health care. A variety of home and community-based services will either have to be cut back or they will have to be eliminated altogether. The criteria to be eligible for services are likely to be tightened because there will be fewer dollars to spend on the people who are receiving services. State and local economies are going to be, are just going to be devastated. In part because there will be less federal spending, less paid to, for example, provider agencies, less in wages, but also because the spending on healthcare will be reduced, and rural hospitals, rural health centers in particular, are going to feel the brunt of that. The prediction is that many rural hospitals will not be able to stay open. Many rural healthcare providers will not be able to continue to provide Medicaid-funded services because the Medicaid funding will not be there. People who desperately need medical care and rely upon the Medicaid system will not be able to find it, or they will have to travel great distances in order to get it. It is going to be an absolute sea change from the way we look at care and human services in our country right now. In addition, it's going to increase the federal deficit and the federal debt. $3 trillion in increase in the federal deficit over 10 years, 15 trillion in our federal debt over 10 years. Again, this bill was passed in the name of tax relief, providing tax cuts, tax breaks to Americans. But ultimately, what it's going to do is cause even greater harm to our economy and especially greater harm to human beings who rely upon social services in our state. Now, a number of times I have said, if fully implemented, it will do all these things. And the reason I've said that is because we really don't know if it will be fully implemented. There are a lot of people saying it might not. There are a lot of people saying it absolutely has to be. That's what we voted for, that's what we want. The reality is that there are many, many procedural maneuvers that can be used to forestall some of the implementation. For example, a number of the SNAP requirements that are part of the bill are set to go into effect on January 1st of 2026. but that's very little time for state agencies to adopt new policies and implement those new policies. They either don't have the staffing or they don't have the funding, or the federal government is not providing the guidance necessary in order to do it in such a short period of time. And so there is a possibility that states will be applying for waivers and extensions to allow them more time to put those kinds of things into place. Similarly, there are going to be court challenges to a number of the provisions of the bill by various agencies, by various organizations around the country. There are going to be a lot of efforts made to hold off on the worst parts of these bills. And it should be borne in mind that a number of the provisions in the bill don't even take effect until January of 2028. I'll leave it to you to decide whether it was intentional or not, but some of the worst Medicaid cuts do not take effect until after the next midterm elections. Those would be in 2026. So there will be a lot of work done to try and ensure that some of these really, really drastic impacts are not felt in our communities. But we have to face the fact that this is the law now, and if these things start going into effect, we're going to have to look at a very different landscape than we have looked at in most of our memory. In most of the time that we've worked in this field or had people we care for relying upon DD services, it is going to be a very, very different environment than we have ever seen before. And we can talk about, I'm certainly happy to answer whatever questions I can about what's likely to come down the road. But the fact is, it is a massive question mark at this point. Even though the bill seems to dictate certain things, we just don't know exactly how those things are all going to play out. So, given that the fight is not over, given that there are things still to be done to head off the worst impacts of HR 1 and these federal cuts, what can you do? Well, I'm going to get on my advocacy soapbox now and say you can make your voice heard. Sign up to receive our newsletter, the ADDPC newsletter. Sign up to get legislative updates from Arizona Achieve, a statewide network of self-advocates. Sign up to follow the Disability Advocacy and Policy Alliance, or DAPA, a new organization that includes the Council, Care for the Caregivers, the ARC of Arizona, Disability Rights Arizona, Encircle Families, what used to be known as Raising Special Kids, a whole variety of different organizations engaged in advocacy on behalf of people with disabilities. Get our updates and reach out to your elected officials so they know, even though this bill has passed, even though the state budget is set for the coming year, let them know where you stand on disability issues, let them know what's important to you and why people with disabilities need and deserve the respect and funding necessary to allow them to live a high quality of life. When the next legislative session comes around, testify at the legislature on bills that affect people with disabilities. Again, make your voice heard. And if you can't testify, at least register your position through the request to speak system on the Arizona legislature's website. Just a reminder of some of the policy priorities that we have here at the council. This is a lot of what we do on a daily basis. This is a lot of what the council funds in the way of grants and contracts in communities around the state. We are always looking for ways to partner with organizations who are committed to these things as well. And we want to make sure that the work we do and the work you do, the work we do collectively can have impact in our state. If there are other things on this that are not on this list that you'd like to discuss with us, you can reach out to me, you can reach out to a member of our staff. We are always happy to talk to you about the things that are concerning you and the things that affect your life. With that, I will come to a close. I will stop talking, answer any questions you have. I think there have been some things in the chat. If there is anything I can address, please don't be shy.
Yeah, see, the first thing in the chat is from Nicole guys. It was towards the top, and she said, "Does this include the Arizona Board of Education?" I think she means we work with the Arizona Board of Education. She can clarify that if she wants, though.
Well, if the question is, do we work with the Arizona Board of Education? We certainly try to. We have a good relationship with the board. When there are issues coming before the board that affect students with disabilities, we absolutely try to make our voice heard. We enter comments. There's some proposed rulemaking coming up related to a couple of issues around students with disabilities. One of which, where we've been active over the last year, is lowering the age at which transition services begin for students with disabilities. Currently, the state law, I believe, says that students have to begin transition services no later than the age of 16. We would like to see that lowered to the age of 14 as a matter of policy, because we believe that students need that additional time and the additional input that they receive from transition specialists in order to be fully prepared to leave the K-12 education system. In some states, that age is as low as 12. I think that would be an ideal world to live in here in Arizona. But for now, we're advocating for it to be lowered to the age of 14. There are some other things as well. We were very pleased that Senator Farnsworth introduced a bill this year that ultimately did not end up passing. It was actually taken over by a strike everything amendment that was related to the graduation age of students with disabilities. It reinforced the law that says students have a right to stay in school beyond the age of 18 in order to receive the appropriate educational services and transition services they need, even up to the age of 22. Senator Farnsworth's bill would have reinforced that and provided some new requirements for education systems around the state. As I said, that bill did not pass, but that's an issue that we continue to advocate for. So anyway, long-winded way of saying, if you're asking, do we work with the Board of Education? We certainly do. We certainly express our position on various topics to them, and we look forward to continuing to work with them into the future.
Next here, there's just some comments. Mike Leva says, Jon Meyers has a great understanding of the legislative process. He does a great job and stuff like that. So, good job. And then,
I have to point out, Mike's on our staff, so, take it with a grain of salt.
Yeah. And then Mike Johnson mentions that there's to also use the RTS system when you're testifying at the legislature. He says, testifying is one of the most important things you can do. So, it is true. And using the RTS system can be a little challenging at times, depending on how you do it. But we as the staff will help you if you need help figuring out how to do that. So, feel free to contact us. Sorry, I answered that question for you, but
that's okay. I did make a mistake, and this is the third in our series of presentations on the legislative session this year. And in one of the earlier sessions I mentioned, I think I made a mistake in saying RTS is a great system. RTS is not a great system, but it's the system we have. It is a way for you to express your opinion. It is a way for you to register to testify. There are millions of improvements that could be made to RTS, but in the absence of legislative funding and legislative personnel to do that, we live with what we have. So we encourage people to use it, knowing that there are some drawbacks to it, there are some limitations on it, but it is certainly better than nothing. And so if you need help with it, as Jason just said, contact us. We can provide some guidance on it. There are other organizations around the state that can help with registering an account and getting you all squared away so that you're able to use the system.
And Carrie mentioned some that tanning was also in the bill, so you can get for the Medicaid bill or for the HR one. She said that you can get tax release for tanning, which I didn't see that in there, but it's a possibility. So
we just have to walk outside in Arizona, don't we?
Yeah. And that's all I saw. So if there's any other questions, feel free to raise your hands and sorry if I missed anything. So.
I did see one comment from Carrie Utizzi at the Arizona Coalition to End Sexual and Domestic Violence related to the Victims of Crime Act that might be removed from the Department of Justice at the federal level and moved to some other agency. This has been, I want to address that because when we talk about the issue of abuse and neglect, it is not just an issue in Arizona, it is an issue nationwide, perhaps it's an issue worldwide. But people with disabilities are at heightened risk for sexual violence, for rape, for incest, for trafficking, for a whole variety of things. And the Department of Justice historically has been a great ally of organizations like ours, organizations like the ARC of Arizona, ACES-DV, other organizations that have been trying to tackle these issues in individual states. And we are seeing some changes now. We have seen diminished support for projects that take on these very difficult issues on these vulnerable populations. And it seems to be far less of a priority at the federal level than it was even very recently. And that's concerning because, as with so many things, without federal funding and without the stamp of approval of agencies like the Department of Justice, it can sometimes be very difficult to get people's attention and get people to take these issues seriously. So it is concerning that something like the Victims of Crime Act, which has funded programs here in Arizona, funded programs led by ACES-DV and led by other agencies. Without that kind of support and funding, it could prove very, very difficult to have any positive impact in that area moving forward.
Yeah, I saw your camera go on. Did you have a comment or anything?
No, that's it.
Okay.
I just added that Focus supports APS in Arizona also, so
Okay.
be a problem too.
Anything else?
I do want to turn over the microphone for just a second to Michelle Thorne from Care for the Caregivers to talk a little bit about some funding that that her organization recently received to support the Disability Advocacy and Policy Alliance, or DAPA, and what some of that funding is going to be used for in terms of educating legislators and educating communities about disability issues. So Michelle, you want to take it away?
Thank you, John. Care for the Caregivers received a grant from Vitalist Health Foundation to be able to provide 6 lunch and learns. And we are going to attempt to carry those out between the first week of December and the first week of January. And we're going to do multi-district lunch and learns. We are going to be starting to reach out to the community soon to gather your thoughts, to see what dates are really more acceptable for you and your community, depending on if you can get out of your area well when the winter is happening in December, and your needs for transportation and accommodation for those lunch and learns. But it's going to be a really great opportunity for you to actually be able to meet with your legislators one-on-one and form that personal connection. I think somebody earlier in the chat said how important it is for your legislators to actually know you and to hear from you and for that relationship to be built. So we are going to try to create 6 opportunities for the disability community to be able to have lunch and learn sessions at the Capitol with their legislators, so that when bills come to the floor that are affecting our community, they actually have touch points within the community they can reach out to, and that you can actually have your voices heard a little bit better because they know you on a personal level. So those are coming. That funding also includes funding for 2 town halls that we will be holding, probably one before we start these lunch and learns, and we'll probably hold one during the legislative cycle just to keep you all updated. Another thing we're gonna try to do with this funding is create a position where somebody can come on and help us track the bills, and then maybe even have weekly meetings with the disability community just to update them on what bills are coming through, what bills are coming into committee, when it's time to do different types of advocacy, whether that's request to speak, or whether it's time to come in and do a testimony in different committee hearings for different bills. So we're going to just really make a very big effort with this next legislative cycle and ones beyond that to keep the community there, present at the Capitol, having a very big voice, and ensuring that there is nothing about us without us, and that our voices are loud and clear in the halls of the Capitol. So I'm very, very excited about what we're going to be able to do with DAPA in the next year, really. Thank you, Jon.
Thank you. Appreciate you sharing that information. If there are any other questions, you're free to come off mute and ask them aloud if you wish, or put them in the chat. I do want to say once again how much we appreciate you being with us today, how much we appreciate your interest in these issues. We often throw around the term disability community, but in fact, we are a community in this state. In many ways, a very tight-knit community. We know each other well, whether we work for a state agency or a federal agency or private citizens, or work for a provider agency, whatever the case may be. We have a common interest, and that is making sure that individuals with disabilities receive the kind of care, the kind of services, the kind of supports they need to be as independent as possible, to make their own determinations about the course of their lives, to be included in their communities and embraced by their communities, to have as great an opportunity as possible wherever they may live. And the more we know, the more we're educated. In particular, the more we educate our policymakers about this community and the needs of this community, the more successful we're all going to be in achieving our goals. So I can't say it enough. We look forward to working with all of you. We have great partners at DDD. We have great partners at Access. We have great partners in other state agencies, and we have great partners in the private sector. And you know, we are much stronger together than we are apart, as was shown this year by the unity of the disability community in fighting for the DDD funding supplemental. That was, if nothing else, that was a lesson in how we can have an impact by making our voices heard. So let's continue that kind of advocacy. Let's continue that kind of effort, and let's work together to make sure that we have the greatest impact possible. Well, if there are no other questions, we won't keep you on the call in uncomfortable silence. We'll let you go with again an expression of our gratitude. Please know that if you have any questions at any time, we are always available. Contact us at your convenience. We'll be happy to talk with you about issues that are affecting your life, and continue to look for word from us through our newsletter and other mailings, through DAPA, through the Arc of Arizona and Arizona Achieve. We look forward to continuing this fight with all of you. Take care.